Welcome back to day two. So I know there's going to be people arriving as we're kind of chatting, and that's okay this morning. Ben and I are going to start with a bit of a conversation between the two of us, reflecting on, I guess, our perspectives of the sector and bringing it back to some of the things that we discussed yesterday as a group and around some of our tables. We're probably going to chat for about 20 minutes. Ben, your instructions were received loud and clear to be borderline offensive, I think it was, and controversial. So we're going to be opening up. I mean, I'll try and do that and sort of prompt some of that. But also then we're going to be opening up to everybody else after about 20 minutes who can ask their borderline and offensive, controversial questions via Slido. And so make sure that you start queuing those up so you can get to the top of the queue and we might have a chance to get to them. So with that, I thought we might kick off. Now, Ben's told me not to be really boring and introduce ourselves, and that it's all kind of online somewhere. But I guess I just wanted to make the content, like sort of start off with a sort of framing conversation that I'm wearing a few different hats. I'm at UNSW, helping to run the Energy Institute there. I'm on the ECA Reference Committee. I'm also the chairman of What Watchers and beetle around with a few other sort of helpful hats on where I can. And Ben, you're at Belong, and what interests me about that is it LinkedIn lists you as a member of the team. So could they not afford a proper job title, or like what is it you're doing? What's your kind of vision?
Oh, it sounded better than janitor, which is more the kind of, mopping up messes and that sort of thing tends to be my bag. So that was kind of it. Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah.
What I did want to reflect on is that you've had an experience in the energy sector and now in mobile broadband and delivery of those sorts of services. And maybe you can kind of, we're sort of tying ourselves in not sometimes as an energy sector, thinking about how do we deal with customers, how do we make things better, what's the future going to look like? And I guess you've kind of been traversing two parallel sectors. And yesterday we heard that the inmates shouldn't be sort of running the asylum. It might be nice to invite people from other asylums in to have a bit of a chat about what we should be doing in both.
Yeah, so I think we tend to, on the inside of the sector, whatever sector we're in, we tend to kind of, we succumb to self-importance, where we think the things we're working on are really kind of awesome and interesting and all that sort of stuff. On the outside for the customer, they actually don't give a shit. But these are two categories that are fundamentally boring. Like people don't wake up in the morning going, I want to think about my telco provider and can't wait to engage with my energy company. It's just not that important, right? So we always overestimate the interest that customers have in this stuff. We need to be near invisible, right? Whereas at the moment, the time that we become visible is the time when we've let people down.
Right.
And I'd say that's the case for both sectors, right? So we've got room to move. But what from an economics point of view as well, I think what's interesting is that they are both capacity constrained equations.
Yep.
Right? So I think the lessons that we can, or the observations and insights we have, can be shared, right? And particularly at Telstra, we've been lucky to, I say lucky, it's necessary for us to be a very active participant in the energy market, particularly when it comes to reliability and the provision of peak energy. So
maybe we should pick up on that a bit, because I think, and come back to the consumer thing a little bit later and engagement and that sort of thing, but because consumers are ultimately the recipients of the price signals that we set, that's a systems kind of thinking approach.
Yep.
From your perspective, what do you think that we could be doing to make things better in the variety of ways that we would define that across the system, thinking about first the sort of wholesale and transmission distribution parts of that system? I mean, what can we do as a sector, and also maybe what has Telstra done in its own business that we might be able to learn from?
Yeah, look, I'm glad you raised the issue of signals. There's a lot of people out there saying, the NEM, the signals aren't strong enough to drive the right decisions, et cetera, et cetera. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Anyone who says the signals aren't strong either don't know where to look or they're not listening. And that's at both ends of the spectrum. You think about where were people putting their money into renewables less than a decade ago. And I'm looking at guys like Mark Collette in the audience. We would chase the spot where the wind was strongest, right? Maybe with a proximity to the transmission grid, right, for connection costs. Now we've seen, apart from seeing a learning curve of 28% compound average over that period. Now, I'll get it mixed up. It's 20-something, right? Solar's a bit steeper. Batteries is even steeper still.
You mean a cost learning curve?
Cost learning curve and effectiveness curve right now. So apart from the fact that that curve has been, travelled across the decade, we're also seeing that people are really changing the basis on which they put stuff. Right, and more importantly, if you look at Bloomberg's recent work on levelised cost of energy of different formats, right? Because we've got to get to coal and nuclear at some point, right? Because I think it'll be a fail.
May as well do it now.
May as well do it now, right? So people banging on about nuclear is the answer. I mean, it's why is it in Western economies that when something's not quite working as people intended, right? The temptation is to say, well, let's chuck it out and get something new. Right? Why is it that we keep going to that sort of thinking instead of saying, what is the supplement? What is the supplementary thing? What's the marginal investment that has the best impact on the overall portfolio? And levelised cost of energy for nuclear, unless you build it in China, according to Chinese standards, which I'll leave that to others to make a call on whether that would work in suburban Sydney. The levelised cost of energy is between $200 and $350 a megawatt hour, right? Now, that's Bloomberg, and you kind of say, well, is that theoretical? Go and have a look at the latest nuclear plant that is being proposed for the UK. It's $150 per megawatt hour. Pounds, not dollars, pounds, right? So, some people kind of ask me about nuclear, well, what about Chernobyl, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, even if you didn't, even if you weren't desperate to live without kind of, the ravages of radiation, all that sort of stuff, we don't need to go there, right? There's a 14-year-old boy in Queensland whose name is Riley Muller. He recently did a project on nuclear, right? And it was, should nuclear be part of the Australian energy mix? His answer was, that's a stupid idea. Right? Not because of safety, not because of planning, not because of politics, and the fact that actually we're debating something that no one's going to invest in anyway, right, in practice. But he made the calculations, he did the maths, and came back and said it doesn't stack up. It's not good for the taxpayer. While we're here, can we go on to coal? Right?
I would like to say though on nuclear that I guess there's a bit of a hope that maybe SMR would be different and modular and have some different characteristics. I agree with you on an energy cost thing, but I think if you're thinking about other services that a thermal kind of style plant could provide, and maybe the fact that that's going to be needed in the market a little bit more in the future, then I sort of starting to kind of think that we've still got some unanswered questions because we don't have the buffers that we used to have in the energy system. If you take out gas, we don't have the long generation situation we used to have, and consumers would pay.
So I agree with you 100%. Right, the signals have to be there for firming, right? And if you look at where the investment is likely to be deployed, in the coming decade, right, it's not going to be in wind without firming, right? It's not going to be without some component of storage. And it's certainly not going to be in energy plants whose duty cycle reinforces the current duck curve, right? It's just, what I mean? The money won't go there, right? So the question is not, what do we get for what base load should we have? The question is, how do we firm what we're ending up with, right? And
supply by demand rather than
absolutely. And look, Snowy's the conspicuous project so that people in government can say, hey, look, we did something, right? And that's great, right? It's not a ridiculous investment, right? So something like that, works quite well. Where we of course get to though is if there are too many interventions, right, and particularly the debate about nuclear, the primary beneficiaries of the nuclear debate are the owners of residual coal assets, right? Because the longer that people go, oh, geez, if people are going to put in nuclear, I won't make my investment in storage. I won't make my investment in firmed solar or firmed wind, which, by the way, you look at 4 hours of storage against the average, production of a wind farm now, you're talking about kind of in the 60s and 70s. Right now, we're a buyer of this stuff. Right, bearing in mind, we got no axe to grind. We are primarily, as in Telstra, we use 1.7 terawatt hours right? We're just a big household, right? We are a really big household, right? So yes, we've made investments in PPAs and that sort of thing over time, not because we're kind of, tree huggers and all that sort of stuff. Great that it's doing that and it is decarbonising the grid, but fundamentally we had to. Right, we had to as a
stable load shape than a household.
Oh, look, we do, but that's kind of. So there's a few aspects to our participation, right? We also sit on an asset, right, that is more sensitive to reliability than the grid, right? So the power goes out. Apart from Tomago, right, people get annoyed. Right, and they get really annoyed if their food goes off in the fridge, right? But really, their phones are still charged, right? They're still online, etc., etc. If our network goes down and they can't get their Insta feed, right, then you know hatred, right? So people come to me saying, oh, it's terrible working in an energy retailer because people get really upset when the power goes out. I'm like, mate, you've got that's nothing. That's mildly indifferent. Like hatred is when the Insta feed drops, right? So our exposure to the peak is actually far more pronounced than people would think, right? So we've got a gigawatt hour worth of storage across the country, and we've got a few hundred megawatt hours worth of peak generation, which we're working with people like. Colette at Energy Australia and other big participants, as well as participating directly as a market generator. Right now, let's just dwell on that for a second. Sometimes, when we inject that capacity into the grid, right, we see differences in wholesale price in those episodes of several $100s a megawatt hour. Right, so our participation in those types of programs reduces prices for all Australians, whether or not they are customers of Telstra, right? So when we talk about signals, like we're sitting here going, the prolonged debate about coal and nuclear, et cetera, that is making it harder for us to direct our capital into those real projects that make a real difference on price, right? And people saying, oh no, well you don't care about reliability. It's like, bullshit. We are more exposed to reliability than anyone else in Australia, right? So if we're not advocating for coal, you've got to ask the question. So there are 40,000 people who are employed in the coal industry in this country, right? Some politicians, depending where they come from, will say, oh no, it's much bigger than that, right? 40,000 people. If you look at the debt spreads, right, that you can get on and say, take our organisation, we have a bit of a carbon footprint, but we're not massively intensive, right? There is a 7 basis point spread, right, on debt that can tick sort of a few criteria around, does it qualify for green bonds? Now, just use that as a proxy, right? That is a proxy for what's happening in global capital markets more generally. And that spread is going to widen. The fact that sovereign funds are no longer providing, certain sovereign funds are no longer providing debt to state governments, right, is a big signal, right? The 7 basis point spread, that's a proxy for all of that stuff, right? So if you take the 7 basis point spread applied to Australia's government debt of, call it 400 billion, right? And then you work out what is that worth over the 20-year bond yield, right? Turn that into today's dollars, that's $5 billion. $5 billion, right, of cost that our country will incur to the extent that it sits at the wrong end of that spread, right? $5 billion could do what for the people who are in the coal industry today? It could give them $100,000 worth of training and relocation. Every man, woman, I won't say child because the children don't work in the mines anymore, do they? No. Every man and woman, right? More men, probably more men than women, but I'm sure they're working on balancing that. 100 grand, right? Now that's 2 times, that's tax-free, 2 times the pre-tax median income of the country. Now I haven't even bothered looking at whether the people in coal, they tend to be regional, right? So there's probably a further enhancement there. But say, call it 2 to 2.5 times. Right, now I'm sure there's a bunch of people here who will go, oh no, that's, econometrics, blah, blah, yada, yada. It's like, roughly speaking, right? Go and do the maths yourself, right? It's not, I did it this morning. Like it's not kind of a massive study. And that's the point. The maths around this stuff, right? If we look for the right proxies, look for the right price signals, right? That's what it is. The other one that's interesting is if we convert it, because gas is like, the saviour, right? So-called. If you can get it out, right? If you can get it out cheaply, right, and do reservation, all that sort of stuff, and decouple from global markets. But even if you do all of that, if you converted the entire economy, call it 200 terawatt hours, to gas at half a tonne, it's 100 million tonnes you've got to abate for, right? In the long run, we will have to, right, because of that spread that we talked about on funding. Now, if we needed to abate that volume, right, on average kind of sequestration rates of 2.5 tonnes an acre, you would need to lock up 35% of Australia's arable land. Even if you put a dog shit crop like, a baseline crop like wheat onto that land at $300 a tonne, that's $11 billion a year, right? Put bok choy or Chinese cabbage into the, because we're going to be the food bowl to Asia. That number, skyrockets, right? So it's worth money to agriculture as well.
So I'm going to have to stop you a minute on wholesale, which we could do all day, I know. And just think about the demand side end of the value chain, because you're a big organisation, you've been able to kind of put your money where your mouth is, hedge some of your risk, that sort of thing. But yesterday we've been talking a lot about smaller businesses and consumers as well. So what does better look like for them, and what should we be doing on the demand side end of things?
So I think three things, some are easy, some are more.
And when I say better, not just clean, but reliable, affordable,
reliable and
some
affordable,
of those other sort of things that the consumers picked up.
Yeah, there's a really interesting, if you look at all the studies in demand side management, because I think most of the policy debate in this country recently has assumed that demand is an exogenous input into the equation, right? That people should just be able to use energy whenever they want, under any circumstances, no matter what the cost to the system. And so, many retailers have kind of gone in and tried to say, hey, if we give you, $2 to, I'm gilding the lily, but we'll give you $2 to turn off your aircon for 2 hours when it's 45 degrees. It's like, not really interested. It's a bit more than that, but the point is, as soon as you get into a pricing equation around that with real households, real families, all of a sudden you've said, I've put a price on your suffering. Are you prepared to take it? Right? Whereas actually, the studies indicate, and we were getting into this at PowerShop. I know Lauren's in the audience here. Oh, he represent. It's like a family, you never leave. We started working with signals that were based on, hey, there's tight conditions in the grid in your area. In the next few hours, would you mind doing X, Y, Z? Far better outcomes. Right? They also did this thing. What was it called? Your community solar. Your community energy, right? It was after I'd left, and I said to the guys, that is not going to work. It's a terrible idea. And it was basically giving other punters who didn't have solar on their roofs, saying, oh no, I want to increase the tariff, the feed-in tariff for the people who do have solar in my neighbourhood. And I thought, no one's going to do that, right? And it sold out in like 4 days, right? Wrong. But again, it's like we keep appealing to people as if they're slot machines. It's coin operated. The point, the analogy I'm trying to land there. Messed it up completely, but you know what I mean. Look, we always assume, test and learn, but appeal to people's. It sounds really woolly, but community spirit actually pays off, right? It's more effective than saying I'm going to put a price on your suffering and it's $2, $10, or $20.
So I'm going to open up to some questions for other people, because I could nibble you all day, but I think it's fair to give some other people a go. So here we go. You can read some of these. There's 10 votes for the top one, so we better start there. Culture.
Yeah, great.
Consumer expectations.
Super. So 15 years ago, right, the equation for solving the exact problem you were describing, which is firming or base load, particularly in the long string, like Charleville, right, out in real Queensland, tough Queensland, in the middle of the country. For 4 hours of the year, they would exceed the capacity of their the cable, the transmission line, and forever, the Queensland DNSPs would say, no, the only way to do it is to duplicate the line for $100 million or something. Mm-hmm. It was going to cost about $2 million to put in a generation format to support that, a localised generation format, right? Culturally, they couldn't get their head around it. So the rules actually said you have to consider these options, and they managed to obfuscate and wriggle and all that sort of stuff. So I think one of the tricky issues we have in energy is that it is a complex industry, right? And the temptation is for people to come in and say things like, oh, we need nuclear, right? When they haven't done the work, right, to do the maths. And so the maths don't lie, and I think we almost need people from multiple angles dismantling what has previously been a very stable mantle of expertise. Right. So for a very long time, DNSP and particularly transmission, they sort of sat at the apex. They were like the guru people in the energy industry. They could say, no, this is how it is, right? Because it was relatively, the conventional model persisted for so long, and it just hasn't caught up. So I think we're getting better, right? We're seeing renewal of, partly it comes from renewal of people, partly it comes from how do we care for each other as humans within an organisation, right? But I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of keep pressuring and supporting. So, it sounds very aggressive when we just do that. But, if we help each other to solve what ultimately is the same problem, and the problem is experienced by Australians' households and businesses across the country.
Yeah, cool. The next question, I'm going to just let you think about that for a minute. I'm going to go to my views and voice because I feel like I've been a bit naughty and just kind of keep letting you take all of the stick. But there's a few things I guess I'd like to get off my chest, and I'll be really quick here. But I've got some worries and some things I think are a bit of crock, actually, in the sector. And my worries are, I mentioned a little bit before, the system buffers disappearing that we used to have and we used to be able to rely on. And I think we can't sort of overlook the fact that just the sort of physics of the system are changing. And that sort of brings me to my next point about timescales are compressing, both in terms of settlement timescales, but also, we had kit that would run with inertia and, you'd get sort of a second worth of grace on some stuff. Now we've got things that are connected with inverters, whether it be large-scale solar and wind or on households. You're seeing those timescales get down to responses in the tens of nanoseconds. Yep. So, how do we respond kind of in the kind of market and talking to consumers and trying to kind of get kit to work together when that stuff happens and cascades on a low voltage network that can cascade up to a high voltage network in milliseconds or less? Yep. And so that's one thing that I kind of am quite concerned about, that the sort of stuff I tried to put in place at AGL about virtual power plants and incentivising consumers and doing all this sort of cool stuff with kit actually can misbehave. And we're finding that there's a lot of misbehaviour of actual kit that passes standards and doesn't quite do what it you think it's going to do. And when you start to multiply that into, all of a sudden you can get sort of, half a gigawatt of, rooftop solar disconnecting because it didn't ride through a little wobble on the grid. Yep. That's a concern that we don't have visibility over. And so that's my third big worry, is we're flying blind on the low voltage network. Yep. And we're not solving that. We don't have the sort of data that a consumer can use to make sense of something and people can respond to, and organisations can give them a little bit of what makes sense to them. Yep. But also that sort of data could flow through into how you operate a network and even what you're going to do with your wholesale kit on any sort of minute of any sort of day. So I think that sort of flying blind issue is something that worries a lot of people wherever they are in that sort of system. So they're the things. And I think I'm just going to raise one thing about, there's lots of things that strike me as a bit of a crock in this sector. Yep. But thinking you can kind of paper over some of that stuff with a blockchain settlement, that's a settlement thing. This whole sector relies on hardware and comms and software and algorithms, and then you finally get to kind of how you bill somebody. So that's not going to paper over some of the other stuff. So that's my 5 cents worth for whoever sort of asked me that. But if we've got time for, I think, a couple more, we're going to go back to your sort of energy and telecoms combining for packages and how to bundle some of this stuff up.
Right.
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. And by the way, your comments on, I think we often conflate a whole bunch of issues when we talk about reliability, right? And so there's the reliability that comes from, big bloody towers and wires being, laid flat by storm weather, right? That's got very little to do with energy mix, right? Then you've got the stuff where you kind of go, actually, we need sort of synchronous condensers or whatever, right? So there is a mix, right? But I think what works in a soundbite, right, for the public, if you were to explain, okay, we need a bit of bit more interconnector, some synchronous condensers, we need pre-ramping of that'll come from the 5-minute pricing, blah 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 blah. Right, people have fallen asleep, right, and so we've got
wandered off.
And so I think the debate is defaulting to what is easy to convey, not what is right. So I think again, it's our responsibility to kind of bring it back to the facts, and it's always difficult to sort of argue the facts with someone who's made their assertion based on no facts at all. But I just think we need to keep trying. I pinched that from someone last night, actually. So
good on you. Yeah, I recycle stuff all the time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. So telco and energy. You wanted to?
So, I mean, it's interesting because yesterday we were sort of talking about, package everything and it's going to be brilliant, and sort of remove that you sort of saying be invisible sometimes, and then we could sort of go all the way through to maybe consumers should be seeing kind of almost real-time price signals, and we should be kind of managing all of that. And to me, there's an inherent tension in that, and probably if we had some data and we had people doing the right things, providing the right insights, we could still get, even if I hid your bill from you and just managed a flat fee, I could still be taking that risk and doing something, and would still need data and insights and that sort of thing. But I could also be providing you with, we chatted yesterday about open data, and there's a question here about it. Later on today, Watches and the Australian government and others are launching the My Energy Marketplace, which is where the consumer owns the data, and you can kind of put that out there with the consumer. The consumer can decide, does someone want to tender for, an app for this or a service for that? And so I think maybe that's where some of the telcos and energy stuff actually does start to kind of be able to combine. Yeah, and
I think Telstra is a beneficiary of anything that kind of looks like big data, and right. So that's our vested interest. But the truth in this, like so many markets, right? Yeah, we'd love to sell kind of big data services and all the rest of it, but actually the data you need to solve these kinds of problems, it's actually pretty simple, right? So if we were in the energy market, I think we'd be saying, sharing the data is helpful, right? Subject to privacy and all the rest of it. Sharing the data is helpful. Not seeking to make money out of that, because I just don't think there's enough in it. But actually what is more important is understanding the psychology of different customer groups, right? Going back to the first point, no one really gives a shit, right? They actually just want it to work. They don't want to feel ripped off, right? And I think even with the big stick and all that sort of stuff, we're still seeing spreads where people have been with their incumbent retailer for a long time. It's difficult to shop, right? But if they do, those who do still save, 25, 30%, right? So it's, we've kind of let people down on that front. And I think they're the basics that are going to build the trust, where you can then go to a customer and say, hey, look, if you had a power wall in your garage and a few panels on your roof, would you be interested in us kind of using that with you, right? And an EV would make it even, more, there'd be even more cheddar in that. But I think, just saying, what's the price signal based on the data, that's not enough. So I'm much more interested in how's the customer feeling, right, about how they've been treated historically and what their outlook is for the future.
That's a lovely place to finish. Thank you. We're out of time, so we'll have to stop all those other questions. But feel free to come and hassle us and be controversial just in one-on-one later. I'm up for it.
Cool.
Cheers. Thank you.